right, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining another of Network 2020's virtual briefing series, Conversations. We are very fortunate to talk today with several experts about a new start, Convergence and Confrontation in US-Russia relations. As you all know, Russia has been occupying the news in recent days with opposition leader Alexei Navalny's arrest and the subsequent protests that are happening across Russia. And it really makes the US-Russia relationship, or sort of the lack thereof, has been thrust into the limelight. The disagreement around, whether US officials are encouraging a protest, comes at a very critical moment. The United States has a new administration and a lot is at stake in its relationship with Moscow. Though the New START treaty was just extended, there are many points of policy contention on the US side remaining, including open skies, Ukraine, disinformation. So there really is a lot to dig into in this topic. So I am really pleased today that we have the experts that we do. Just a little bit about Network 2020. We are a nonprofit organization. We're based in New York, and we're a global organization that is inclusive. We're international. We're really focusing on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds. We really want to be able to use our extensive network to drive innovative research and solutions to critical foreign policy challenges. So we have a number of programs in addition to this virtual briefing series. So please check out our website, follow us on all of the social media. We would appreciate it. Just a brief announcement, we do have our Innovators Awards in Global Affairs, which will be announced at our virtual benefit on March 24th, but we are looking for applicants right now. The deadline is February 12th. I believe we might be pushing that back a little bit, but we are looking for nominees in the following categories. The nominees are smaller organizations, young, like about 5 to 7 years old, that are working and taking innovative approaches to tackling challenges in the foreign policy space. So whether it's environment or humanitarian aid, all of the categories are listed there, but it's a really great opportunity to raise the profile of your organization. So if you are, someone who's working in another organization, please do check out the Innovators Awards in Global Affairs. So with that, I would love to introduce our panelists. And first off, we have Ambassador Stephen Pifer. And just so you know, I will be referring to everyone by their first name with their permission. But for the sake of the bio, Ambassador Pifer, he is now a research fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. He is also affiliated with Stanford Center on International Security and Cooperation and Brookings. He spent decades in the US Foreign Service with a real focus on former Soviet Union and Europe, and as well as arms control and security. So he is perfectly ripe for this kind of conversation. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary and had responsibilities for Russia and Ukraine, and he was ambassador to Ukraine as well, among his many other bona fides. So we're so delighted to have him with us. We also have Victoria Zhuravleva, who is a doctor of science and a professor of history and international relations and chair of the Department of American Studies from the Russian State University for the Humanities. Her research really focuses on representations and images and myths in the US-Russian relationship. So I think a very interesting field of study. She has a book, Understanding Russia and the United States, Images and Myths, as well as a lot of other texts that are that dig into the power of images and myths in this relationship. And she is also an alumni of the Fulbright program and the Kennan Institute program. And last but not least, we have Clint Watts, who is a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a non-resident fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. He is a national security contributor and really focuses on terrorism, counterterrorism, and social media influence and Russian disinformation. He has testified in front of the 4 different Senate committees and was a notable voice talking about the rise of Russian influence operations via social media leading up to the US presidential election of 2016. He is a frequent contributor to many journalists, to many outlets, and he, among other commentary that he gives. So with that, I am going to stop my introductions and talk very briefly about the post-event discussion group. So if you like this discussion, if you have a lot to say, please stick around after. What we will do, Brian will pop a little link in the chat box toward the end of the conversation. So once you click on that, you will leave this discussion and go to a post-event discussion group for about 15 minutes to just talk to some of the other participants about what you learned and what is interesting. It may take a few minutes to segue from ending this webinar to go into those discussion groups, so just be patient, but it's a wonderful way to get to know other people who are on the call and talk about what you've learned. So with that, let's move on to why we're really all here, which is to talk about US and Russia relations. So Ambassador Pifer, or Steve, I apologize. I would like to start with you. Among the issues on the table when President Biden took office was an extension of New START, the Open Skies Treaty, and the simmering conflict in Donbass, to name a few. So as a former ambassador, can you walk us through some of the top priorities you see when it comes to diplomacy with Russia? And how do the Navalny protests and the US response factor into that?
Yeah, well, thank you, Courtney. Let me begin by saying that Joe Biden took office at a time when the US-Russia relationship was at its lowest point since the end of the Cold War in 30 years. And when you look at that agenda, you see lots of problems. The Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russian interference in American domestic politics, cyber attacks, democracy, human rights issues, and the Russians have their own set of grievances. There's a frustration on both sides. I think President Biden is going to be prepared, on the one hand, to call out and push back against egregious Russian misbehavior. But he's also going to be prepared to engage in dialogue where American and Russian interests coincide. And I would argue that we saw this in the first week of the Biden administration, where on his first full day as president on January 21st, the president said he was prepared to extend the new Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty, New START, for 5 years, because he concluded correctly that was in the American security interest. But then 3 days later, when you had the demonstrations in Russia about the Navalny arrest and mass protest, you saw a very quick and very sharp condemnation from Washington. And this is actually, this combination, this is not unusual in American policy. I mean, go back, for example, to Ronald Reagan's second term in the late 1980s, where you negotiated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. They made a lot of progress on the first Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty. There was progress on human rights, but the United States was still pumping Stinger missiles and weapons into Afghanistan to drive the Soviet military out of there. So you can do this combination of pushback and dialogue. And that's going to be different from the last 4 years. I think on one hand, the Kremlin was sorry that Mr. Trump did not win re-election. He widened divisions within the United States. He weakened American alliances, and he tarnished America's reputation overseas. So if you're sitting in the Kremlin, what's not to like? But on the flip side, I would argue that if you look at the Trump administration, there was nothing of consequence that was accomplished that was positive for US-Russia relations. Now, I think President Biden, he's going to be a change, and there may be, some things here that might be of interest to Moscow. First of all, he's going to be in sync with his own administration's policy, and that wasn't the case the last 4 years. I cannot imagine a harder job in Moscow than being the America watcher in the Kremlin, because how could you explain an American president who never criticized Putin, who never criticized Russian actions? Yet there was an American policy that was actually quite tough. It meant more sanctions on Russia. It was supportive of Ukraine, including providing lethal military assistance to the Ukrainians. And it took steps to build up the American and NATO military presence in the Baltic region in Central Europe. Now, you're not going to have that dichotomy. I mean, the policy and the president will be aligned. And in Moscow, they are not going to like some aspects of that policy, but it's going to be predictable. I think President Trump saw value in being unpredictable. I disagree. I think the American president should be very predictable. We want both allies and adversaries to know how we're going to respond if they do certain things. A second part about President Biden is he does understand the value of guardrails, that when you have a relationship that has large adversarial components, there's value in doing things like arms control, extending the New START treaty so that you can contain that adversarial component, so that you can contain the nuclear competition between the two countries. Third, I think that President Biden, you're going to see at the high levels a professionalization of the dialogue. President Trump, by most accounts, went into meetings with Vladimir Putin. Yeah, it's unclear whether he read his briefing memo. He winged it. And Vladimir Putin goes into these meetings extremely well prepared. And I don't think that is a combination that allows you to really make serious progress. At some point, I'm sure that there's going to be a meeting between Biden and Putin. Biden will be prepared for that. The agenda will be set, and he'll be prepared to deal in a serious way if there are possibilities. And I think the last point I'd make is that, well, President Trump wanted very fast results. He wanted to do everything at one meeting. I think President Biden understands that solving difficult issues, and these are some very difficult issues on the US-Russia agenda, that's going to take time. You're going to have to process. You're going to have to make an investment. So I think there's some possibilities here. Now, this is not going to be a reset, but perhaps the Biden administration can chip away at some of these problems over time, and we'll see. Now, specifically on the agenda, there's a combination of things where we can work together, and there are problems. We've already seen the two sides. Yesterday, they formally exchanged the diplomatic notes that extend the new Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty until 2026. That's a good thing for American security. You also saw, though, in the statement issued by the Secretary of State that the United States wants to go further and would actually like to launch a negotiation with Russia that covers all American and Russian nuclear weapons, which is a logical next step. Now, my guess is the Russians will say, if you want to talk about that, we've got to raise other issues: missile defense, long-range conventional strikes, space, cyber. There's a bunch of questions, and these are going to have to be sorted out in some fairly complex talks. There's also going to be difficult issues. Ukraine, which is probably the biggest single problem on the US-Russia agenda. And there's a question, I would divide it out. Crimea is going to be a long-term problem. That's going to be with us for some time to come. But is there a possibility to make some progress in resolving the ongoing conflict in Donbass? Now, thus far, it appears that the Kremlin has done its calculation of costs and benefits and seems to believe that sustaining that conflict in Donbass is valuable in terms of destabilizing, distracting, diverting the attention of the government in Kyiv. But there would be a question: would a more active American role perhaps change the game board in a way that might be able to move that a bit towards progress? Other difficult issues: cyber, disinformation. Human rights is now very much back on the agenda, but human rights has been often on the US-Soviet and US-Russia agendas. That's not a surprise. And of course, Mr. Navalny is going to figure very much into this. And to some extent, the timing is probably a little bit awkward, because I think there will be an American response. Well, there should be a Western response. And my guess is that the administration plans to consult with Europe and consider, are there steps that should be taken, additional sanctions, things like that. But again, it gets back to the overall approaches. I think the Biden administration will be prepared to do that pushback, to do sanctions when there are things that Russia does that we consider having crossed red lines, but at the same time, on those issues where there's a convergence of interest, be prepared to talk. So maybe I'll stop there with that overview.
Right. Terrific, thank you. Just one really quick follow-up. I've read a little bit about the extension of New START and have seen some critics saying, okay, well, we went straight for the full 5-year extension. What do you think the Biden administration's reasoning was behind doing that, and do you think it was the right move?
Well, I think it very much was the right move. Those who argued for a shorter extension of 1 or 2 years, their argument was, well, this will give us leverage with the Russians. Well, we saw the Trump administration try in the fall, and it really didn't give us any real leverage with the Russians. Second, if we had just a 1 or 2 year extension, when we reached the end of that time, I think the pressure actually would be back on Washington. And finally, I think one other reason to extend the treaty for 5 years is, if the administration is serious, as I believe it is, in getting to a next negotiation that looks at all nuclear weapons, strategic, non-strategic, so everything, Washington, Moscow, put everything on the table, that's going to be a lengthy negotiation. It's going to require the sides address, for example, verification issues. How do you monitor nuclear weapons and storage sites? Both militaries are going to be awfully nervous about that. That's going to take time to work out. And again, I think in the connection, the Russians are likely to raise questions that the American side is not excited about talking about, things like missile defense, long-range conventional strike. It's going to take time. It won't be like the New START treaty, which was negotiated basically within a year. And so having the 5 years gives the sides times to figure out what they need to do and then actually sit down and work it out.
All right, terrific. Thank you. Thank you for that. And just as a reminder to everyone listening, if at any point you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. Switching gears a little bit, Victoria, I'm really glad we have you on this panel because I think your work is really fascinating and very relevant, because at least, one thing that I've noticed here in the US is that the narratives about certain countries, and Russia is one of them, get pretty one-dimensional, and that happens at a young age. I have young kids, and I can't tell you how many villains in cartoons have Russian accents, for example, which I think is just one small example. So, I'd like to just ask you about representations of the United States and Russia and what trends you've been seeing, and what does that say to you about relations between our countries, and why is that imagery important?
Thank you, Courtney. Let me begin from the idea that mutual perceptions and mutual representations have cyclical character, and this cycle of hopes and disappointments has been defined and still defines not only by the events in another country, but by the domestic agenda of Russians and Americans themselves. This context determines the hierarchy of the images, given some of them the central roles and relegating others to the periphery. By the way, that is why we can trace constant desire to use American cut in Russia and Russian cut in the United States for the domestic political games. And this is a constant trend. The negative attitude towards the United States in Putin's Russia, in this case, I mean official Russia, official discourse, state-controlled media, largely can be explained as a reaction to the US global leadership and to Russia's loss of the position in a post-bipolar world. But this is only one side of this problem, because on the other hand, this is the reaction to the domestic challenges. The image of the American demonic other is still very useful in Putin's Russia for national consolidation and for the construction of national idea. Not only because of the Cold War legacy, but also because of the legacy of 1990s, when the asymmetric character of bilateral relations was established. In reality, open confrontation with the West has given a powerful boost to Russian patriotism. In public speeches and in politics, Vladimir Putin himself and a high-ranking Russian official try to destroy the American teacher, Russian student scheme, and try to demonstrate Putin's Russia desire to be teacher itself, teaching the United States the lessons of Russian national interests. In the center of this anti-American discourse, special role plays dichotomy Russian conservative nationalism versus American liberal universalism. From my point of view, there is a close connection between anti-liberal ideas and anti-American ideas in public and official discourse, in media discourse, if we are talking about state-controlled media. So the current war of images, in reality, this is a war of values and ideas. And in this case, we are dealing with the value-based approach to Russian-American relations as during the Cold War. This is most powerful factor in American policy, but from the Russian side as well. Russian state-controlled media, pro-Kremlin experts and politicians highlight the fact that America has serious problems in its domestic and foreign policies. And the desire of the United States to write the lessons of democracy, international stability, or international order, or political or economic stability, Russians is ludicrous, is simply ludicrous. And especially it works now during the political crisis in the United States, segmentation and polarization of the American society after the 2020 presidential elections and the Capitol riots organized by Trump's supporters. This election, these presidential elections and generally became an additional confirmation of fundamental deficiencies in the US social and political system, and thus is a powerful argument in favor of Putin's regime. Of course, the anti-American sentiments in Russian society is a function of propaganda, of course. And in this case, anti-Americans among the Russian populace has roots in the national-wide demand for greatness. But this is only on the one hand, because at the same time, behind anti-American or pro-American sentiments stand a very complicated complex of love, hate, feelings toward the United States, all of which have deep historical roots. Small quotation. This is from a work of Russian sociologist Alexei Navalny. America is our only quintessential other. The rivalry with America does not unfold in the arena of the real world, but in its reflection that exists in the Russian mass consciousness. And in this sphere, what matters is not defeating the other, but being completely certain that we are not worse than them. In this worldview, examples of good relations with America are acknowledgement that they are equal to us or similar to us, and we to them as the only basis for mutual good feelings. Very right and interesting idea. By the way, that is why Vladimir Putin initiated joint statement with Donald Trump on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the meeting of Soviet and American troops at the Elbe River. Because what does it mean, the spirit of the Elbe? This is the symbol of equality in relationship between Soviet Union and the United States. And this is the additional confirmation that two countries have opportunity to be in cooperation regime in spite of ideological confrontation and ideological differences. To change the ecological climate, I mean the stable hierarchy of collective and personified images, and to decrease the heat of the information war between the two countries, it's necessary to stabilize Russian-American relations and to expand areas for interactions. Achieving this goal is extremely difficult task because of the lack of trust in bilateral relations, the internal situation in Russia, the anti-Russian consensus in the United States. And the history of Russian-American relations testifies to the fact that the period of approachment happened during the times when we can see political or economic reforms in Russia, be it the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or post-Soviet Russia, and when Americans exported goods, ideas, technologies, and when Americans taught Russians lessons of democracy and capitalism. I don't see such opportunity in foreseeable future. At the same time, the periods of rapprochement also happened during those times when Russia and the United States have expanded their pragmatic agenda of their relations in order to face a common enemy. It's happened during the world wars or at the beginning of the global war against terrorism. The main problem, as I mentioned before our conversation, how to find balance between value-based approach and pragmatic approach. And in spite of these values discussed and in spite of confrontation and we will see the continuation of confrontation. Of course, there is a room for interaction, and Ambassador Pifer mentioned about these possibilities in a sphere of strategic stabilities, in the sphere of global challenges, be it pandemics or climate changes, or in some regional conflicts. Of course, the Biden administration will pay more attention to the human rights issue in Russian-American relations. This is understandable because of the domestic situation in Russia, or to the new repression measures against Alexei Navalny, representatives of Russian opposition, and the new sanctions could be expected. But from my point of view, at the same time, it will be professional and predictable policy, I mean Russian policy, and among those who will be in this professional team, including Victoria Nuland, we see persons who are ready for principled pragmatism in relationship with Russia. So maybe I stop here. I see time.
Thank you. No, you have a lot to say, and I have a lot of questions, but so our audience does too. So I want to make sure we get to all the panels, and then we'll get to the questions, because I do, you bring up a lot of really fascinating points, and I think, you know, the idea of trust and finding areas of mutual cooperation is important. But I'm also seeing a lot of interesting commentary in the Q&A box too. So we'll get to that. But one point of contention, I think, is, and this is turning to you, Clint, you were one of the top voices testifying in US Congress about Russian social media influence campaigns following the 2016 presidential elections, well, leading up to the campaigns leading up to, and then you testified following. The story after the 2020 election was less focused on disinformation from Russia and more on the SolarWinds cyber attack. So can you put this attack in context and really talk about, you know, where are you most concerned? Is it about hacks like SolarWinds? Is it about disinformation? Is it both? You know, when you're looking at that landscape, what is it that would be a top priority from your point of view?
Yes. So I had a team that worked on part of the election 2020 defense, and Russia was part of it. Iran was actually more active, you know, as a separate topic, in my opinion, in many ways, in terms of more harassment, you know, of disinformation, that kind of thing. China was essentially inactive, couldn't really care much at all about the election. And so we worked that program for about 20 months, and we still continue to monitor. And so what's interesting is Russia had, from the Russia state-sponsored hacking, Russia state-sponsored propaganda, the fringe sort of news networks, which were outed by the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, the social media companies, which took down month after month, you know, more takedowns. You could go to Facebook every month and they would take down a Russian aligned network that was trying to talk about the election. They were really shoved back on the disinfo front around just the electoral issue. Separately, though, it does show how Russia is firmly committed in that space of malign influence, but also in cyberspace and hacking, because SolarWinds was happening at the same time. And so from a US government and, you know, public-private sector partnership, we were putting everything towards the election, and yet this other major breach, a very sophisticated one, you know, is ongoing. At the same point, the SolarWinds, while they did gain access, I'd like to remind everybody that SolarWinds can be thought of as, imagine a bank robber or a burglar has keys to every house in your neighborhood, but do they have enough time to rob everyone's house? That's kind of a way to think about the cyber breach. I don't think we know the depths to which the Russian hacking crews actually took information out. They definitely did, but I don't think we know the severity of the loss, meaning they could have gotten into or may have just opened the door in a few places. They didn't necessarily take all the valuables out of the house in every place. It actually takes tons of time, you know, at different points to pull all that information out. I think the damage isn't entirely known yet. Separately, having watched this over the last, we started watching the Russian influence networks in 2013, up to today. What I find most remarkable in the social media era is the convergence. So if I looked at it from an information standpoint, there's no such thing as Russia or the United States to me. Those are artificial parameters in the virtual world. They don't match to anything I observe anymore. I really can't even, like, people will say, well, what's Russia doing? And I would be like, what part of Russia, right? There's these massive pro-Navalny networks, and then there's the Putin disinformation machine. And then there are oligarchs that own different media outlets around the world that are pushing Putin propaganda and Russian issues at times, but also pursuing their own oligarch interests at times. And it's a very convoluted space. And then when I push back to the United States, I could say the same thing. And if you looked at a lot of the extremists that rushed the capitals, if you were in their online space, they were consuming Russian propaganda, or some even wore Russian combat patches from Donbass in North Carolina in one of their militia groups, right? And so you go, what is the US and what is Russia, right? There's all these linkages now in the virtual space with information. And what I see is two totally different nations. One is a hard right, white nationalist sort of power vertical that extends from Russia through Europe to the United States. And I see a very pro-democracy, liberal values, globalist versus nationalist sort of frame that is everything from Navalny to, Navalny in Russia all the way back to the US, and sort of what might be collectively known as the Democrats, but that's even a little fuzzy at this time. And so what I think the information environment that we have today has done is it's reshaped everything to where a Russia-US conversation almost is devoid of reality, and a domestic and foreign conversation in either state is almost devoid. I think that's kind of what Victoria was talking about, that domestic politics play very heavily on these international linkages. And so what is domestic and foreign? Canada declared the Proud Boys a terrorist organization, which is residing in the United States, right? And then America declared the Russian imperial movement a foreign terrorist organization, which is a white supremacist group, which if I went online, they're all in the same chat forums, right? Like they're all together in one place. And so I think we're at a weird turning point where this very much fits with Putin and the active measures philosophy that while America focuses state to state, we're going to focus on party and people. We're going to focus on those two layers. And you can see the convergence. I think if there's anything that the Russian disinformation and sort of propaganda system has done, is it's relied on a set of values that is nationalist, not globalist. Traditional values, Christianity, not other values or other religions. It is, our tech, not big tech. It is aligning on these issues that very much match up in the United States in ways that would surprise people, to where you have someone show up at a Trump rally with a t-shirt that says, I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat. And I think that's highly illustrative of that nation that I would observe. If I mapped it out, that to me would be more representative of how the world really is working. The constant is Vladimir Putin, at least up to now. He has been the constant. And the variable is the United States, where every 4 years, a different nation inside the US takes charge. And they align with different audiences inside Russia in different ways, and in Europe in different ways. And so I am kind of watching that. And on the periphery almost are Russian hacking crews of the GRU and the FSB, and then the NSA and the CIA and US institutions on the other side. They're almost in this weird space where they're not even sure where to navigate to or around at different times. So I think there's a total reshaping of that. I also think there's a reshaping of alliances around these party and people connections. Today, I would tell you that I would trace out Russia's influence using fringe news outlets, and it would go to parts of Ukraine, Serbia, Hungary, traditional like levers of power, but not entirely. And same with the United States, it would track in different ways to Western Europe in terms of those alliances. And then there's a third part, I don't want to go on too long, but that we're taking out of the discussion that will be the most pivotal of all of it, which is China. So whether it's disinfo and propaganda, China is quickly overtaking Russia. So the Kremlin and Putin, they are the masters of the art of propaganda and disinformation. China has the science. And so they are going to demolish this they've learned everything that the Russians have done, and now they have Huawei and big tech and apps and platforms, and they're expanding around the world. And this is creating what I think the big question for the next decade is the three internets. There'll be the free internet, there'll be the Chinese internet, and then there'll be a distorted version that shapes a lot of these nations, which is the authoritarian controlled one, where they control to different degrees the information that their population can get. The best example I could give right now is TikTok. So TikTok, a Chinese app, right, but is exported to the rest of the world. Donald Trump tries to ban TikTok from the United States because it's a China app. Right now, if you went in, Putin would say that TikTok is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Victoria, but when I'm watching that, it will say TikTok is the American social media app by the CIA to lift up Navalny. And I bet if you're at TikTok, you're like, I thought we were based in Los Angeles, right? Like, I don't even know. Like, it's so confusing, right, to understand where you sit in that space. So this is that virtual physical world crossover now that's sort of happening in such a fascinating way that I struggle to even articulate. Like, when I go to DC, that's the last place where they ask me about Russia. What is my take on Russia? And I feel confused about how to even answer that sometime, because I don't know what I would tell a diplomat or what I would tell an intelligence officer or what I would tell an NGO to do or who to interact with, because the levers of influence in the online space don't match up with a government official. I don't know. It's just something interesting that I find right now as I struggle. I hate saying Russia this, US this, because Russia's a lot of different things and US is a lot of different things right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. It is one of the things that I think will make this particular conversation really interesting and also kind of difficult to chart, because on the one hand, we have, Ambassador Pifer, Steve, who, you've worked on along the diplomatic lines, and you're talking about how, how can the governments find, points of collaboration, and how do we, maintain these government to government relationships. But in that sort of, it almost seems like that's on top, and then underneath you have this, Victoria, you alluded to it, this the values clash, but the values don't always line up purely, US versus Russia. It's there are a lot of different dimensions. So there's a real complexity to this story that's coming out from each of your commentary. It's fascinating. So with that, it's hard to turn to the chat box, but let me go to the Q&A box, because there are a lot of questions coming in. What I think we'll start with is something a little bit more traditional, because we're getting a few questions on New Start. And I'm just going to try to pull a few of them together. We have someone who's interested in whether or not China should be included in the New Start negotiations. And let me see. And also someone who wants to know about Russia's view of the extension of New Start and the way ahead on arms control future negotiations. So Steve, I'll turn to you for that, if you wouldn't mind just giving a little bit of commentary.
Okay, well, I think it's pretty clear that the Russians wanted to extend New Start for 5 years. I mean, Putin proposed that 2 years ago, because the Russians, they also see value in having predictability about American strategic forces, and they see value in having those forces capped. Now, the unknown question is whether the Russians will be prepared to go beyond New Start and negotiate, for example, deeper reductions in nuclear weapons, and then bring all nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia onto the table. And I don't think we know that yet. And that may well depend on Washington's readiness to take up issues like missile defense and conventional strike. But I think historically, you can go back to the late 1960s. Moscow has, I think, always wanted to have some kind of cap on American strategic forces. It's valuable to them in the same way that for the United States, having a cap on Russian strategic forces has value. On the question of China, I don't see China in a trilateral negotiation. I think the Trump administration arms control people played that issue completely wrong. And it was interesting to me that even though the administration had been talking for almost 2 years about bringing China in, they never articulated a proposal for doing so or even the outline. And here's the problem. The United States and Russia each have approximately 4,000 nuclear weapons in their total active arsenal. China's about 300. The United States and Russia are not prepared to negotiate an agreement and reduce down to China's level. And they're not prepared to negotiate an agreement to allow China to build up to their level. And I'm pretty sure China would not accept an unequal treaty. So a treaty is just not going to work. And the Chinese were pretty adamant about that. Now, the way I do think it would be good to bring China in, but I'd suggest a different way. And that would be for the United States and Russia to do one more agreement, ideally with significant reductions and ideally covering all their nuclear weapons, and then go to China. But also I think you'd have to talk to Britain and France as well, if the Russians would insist, and ask those three countries to say, look, as long as the United States and Russia are coming down, you should take on a unilateral commitment not to build up. And so it would begin to get them a little bit in the process. I think that would be hard to negotiate with Beijing, but it would be much easier than trying to get them into a negotiation and asking them to accept an unequal limited treaty.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn back to you, Clint, for a little bit, because there are some questions coming in, and I'll just, again, bundle a few of them and you can take them as you will. You know, some questions about whether or not there are any differences between Russian and Chinese propaganda, and what you know about the Olgino troll factory. And let me see. And then if you would just want to comment on Russian psychological warfare.
Sure.
Well, that's a lot to cover. So take it as you will.
I'll start at the end and then kind of layer on how China's different, because the components can kind of be explained. So the troll factory is just a way to do, to essentially produce content in a social media way that does two things. One, that confirms and puts out the message in the language and to the targeted audience that Russia would like to put out. But the second thing is it looks like and talks like the audience that is trying to engage, meaning that there are social media personas, I'll use election 2016, that look like and talk like Americans, that are 80% of the time saying what that audience is saying, and 20% of the time trying to advance a position that the Kremlin prefers on whatever the issue might be. And so they simply, they're a way, it's kind of it's like a assembly line almost. You build base content, which could be news articles or blogs, very stripped out. Then you create social media personas. They talk back onto and link to the base content of those blogs. And then a third layer is you create memes or videos or those sorts of things. They all relate to each other. And you're creating a social media ecosystem on multiple platforms that creates this Potemkin village, which is a Soviet concept, right, of a much larger audience, because people tend to believe four things: that which they see first, that which they see the most, that which comes from a trusted source, and that which is not accompanied by a rebuttal. So social media is that perfect engine to do that. You can get there very quickly. You can just do it over and over again. The source is trusted in that community because it's not the news source, it's your friend or follower who shared it with you. And if you don't like what someone's saying, you just block them. So you can kind of create like this bubble. When you look at what the Russian system was doing outside of Russia, and it was perfected inside of Russia, really, not the whole propaganda disinfo system was really managed democracy, Surkov, some of those things. It was about how do you manage the Russian population in a open information environment is a way to think about it. But once they learned like, oh, we can export this. And I think that really came with the Arab Spring. I think for them watching the Arab Spring and seeing an anonymous movement move around and rally physically in a foreign country, that was like groundbreaking to them that you could do this. That was what they wanted to do with active measures during the Soviet era. It was very difficult to achieve in a foreign country with spies and, you know, building a newspaper in a foreign country, very hard. Social media, very easy to do. But what is consistent, I think, in comparing the Russian approach to China approach, and I'll try and go real short here because I don't want to go too long, is Russia essentially goes into these audience spaces of Western democracies, and the message, and I'll use some slang, is you suck, you suck, you suck, you suck. Everybody sucks. You can't trust anybody. China is very different. In certain places now, they're adopting the Russian approach in certain locations. But across the board, China comes through and says, we're great, we're great, we're great, we're great. America, you suck too, but we're great. They're offering an alternative. It's very different when you watch it over a constant period. That's a simplified version. But, you know, I could give you 20,000 samples and it would kind of look like that. And that's because China is actually trying to replace the US in terms of influence in other places. Whereas Russia is just saying, no, I'm going to tie you up or kind of hold you back. And I want to break alliances so I can pivot with my own power in different ways. China is literally saying, our vaccine is great. It's great. Ignore that 70%, Sputnik 5, 90%, Moderna 90%. China's vaccine's great. Those are terrible. You know, they're using a very different approach because they are trying to replace in that system. The second part about China is their use of technology is remarkable. Synthetic media, deep fakes, audio, they are in YouTube with bots the way the Russians started off with bots 5 years ago on a devastating scale. This will be the new story we talk about in the coming years. And that they're able to replicate it so quickly. It will be interesting to watch. They just don't have the cultural dimension down. So the Russians really know how to impersonate Americans. The Chinese are not very good at impersonating Americans yet, but they'll get there.
So it sounds like it would not be a good thing if they all come together. But,
no, they are though. I just want to add that in many places we see Chinese propaganda outlets sharing office space with Russian propaganda outlets just for awareness purposes.
Interesting. That is very interesting, and it's also interesting what you said too about sort of the ideological component, because we've had a lot of conversations here about China and, you know, the terminology of using a new Cold War when it comes to China. And a lot of the experts that we talk to say, you know, well, that would be a misnomer, in part because there isn't this ideological stance, but at the same time, there is still this, you know, raising up or presenting of an alternative, which is an interesting facet. Okay, a lot of questions. I want to find one. I had one for you, Victoria, where, let me see if I can find it. Someone wanted to ask you about your thoughts on improving U.S.-Russia relations, and what is your attitude toward that? Do you think that cooperation can happen only if there's a common enemy, or if Russia starts entirely to reform? What is the middle ground, and where do you see cooperation and improvement in relations coming from?
I suppose the first step will be selective cooperation in those spheres where Russia and the United States have common interests, and we mentioned this sphere for pragmatic cooperation. I don't see, yes, maybe it could be a common enemy, but not as it was during the world wars. It could be global terrorism, it could be global challenges. In this case, we have opportunity to talk about common enemy. First of all, pragmatic approach, very slowly way to the better understanding, to diplomatic conversation. And I have hope that we will see good perspectives maybe in 3 or 4 years, because I don't believe that now we are dealing with the new Cold War. Maybe in some element of discourses, maybe in rhetoric, but in reality, we are living in another world. We are living in a world where exists post-information society. In Russia, for example, we have social media, we have semi-official, and we have independent media. And for example, social media, I mean, Russian segment of internet is a very important platform for the exchange of ideas, for the exchange of opinions, for the improvement of better understanding between Russia and the United States. We have opportunity to organize exchanges, I mean cultural exchanges, academic exchanges, I received the opportunity 3 years ago in the middle of crisis in Russian-American relations to open American Studies Department. Could you imagine, in Moscow University? And they have a lot of students and they would like to know better the United States. We've just finished huge internet project in cooperation with the American Cultural Center of the US Embassy. The title of this project, Discover America. It will be 5 courses, 80 lectures in Russian and in English, 80 videos, podcasts about different aspects of American history, of American reality. This project has been done by specialists on American studies from St. Petersburg University and from my university. I initiated this project. This is for Russian segment of internet, for those who would like to look at the United States through the eyes of Americans. And this is a good news in reality, because many people in Russia would like to know this country. During this crisis, the level of immigration was really very high. What does it mean? This is the symbol of romantic images of the United States in Russian consciousness. This is idea about the United States as the country of opportunities. And this is a very old story. This is the country of pursuit of happiness, opportunities. This is the technological and industrial paradise. This is a promised land, and so on and so far. And history of Russian-American relations testifies about this trend. And we need to know this common past of Russians and Americans, in spite of ideological confrontation, because in history of Russian-American relations existed not only confrontation, but common agenda, common enemies, common desire to do their countries better and to teach each other. So that is why I believe that step by step, the Russian-American relations would be better. Of course, it depends on many factors, on domestic situation, on climate of Russian-American relations, on new challenges, or on the absence of these challenges. So we will see. But all history of Russian-American relations testifies to the fact of cyclical character of Russian-American relations. Now we are in the bottom of the cycle. So what we can see in the future, only the increased phase of these high cycles in Russian-American relations. We have opportunity to organize contact within diplomatic relations between expert societies, between academic societies, using internet, using our ideas. We are living in another world. This is not the world of the Cold War. Yes. So I have hope.
Well, it would be great to get a similar course for Russian history, I think, in here in the U.S. I think many of us here underappreciate or don't know about just some of the huge areas of cooperation, including the role of the Soviet Union in World War II, which is so fundamental. Steve, I'd like to turn to you quickly with the question that someone was asking about. In particular, because you're sitting in Berlin now, what is the role of the EU or Germany in particular in can they play any leverage in the improvement of U.S.-Russia relations?
I think Germany plays a very interesting role, in part because of Germany's own very complex relationship with Russia. And you've seen, I think, though, in the last several years, though, a desire both for cooperation, but also to push back against Russian misbehavior, and a toughening of German views over the last 6 or 7 years. And I think this is primarily due to Chancellor Merkel's own calculation of how the West should respond to Russia. And she's actually, I think, been quite effective in bringing the European Union along. You now have every 6 months, the European Union, as a matter of routine, extends sanctions on Russia related either to the Russian seizure of Crimea or the Russian conflict against Ukraine and Donbass. And my guess is that people back in Washington in 2014, had you told them that in 2021, the European Union would have had maintained the sanctions and deepened the sanctions, I think people have been quite skeptical about that. And Chancellor Merkel, I think, deserves a lot of credit. And there has been, I think, fairly close cooperation between the United States and the European Union in sort of managing sanctions, which makes sense because sending a unified message probably gives it greater weight in Russia. Now, on the flip side is if there are some openings, I think Europe would like to move to a better place in terms of its relationship with Russia. And this comes back to, I think, this big issue of Ukraine, where both Chancellor Merkel and French President Macron they're the ones who convene what's called the Normandy format or the Minsk group, which has tried to broker a solution between Moscow and Kyiv regarding the conflict in Donbass. They have not had a lot of success to date, but they've tried. And again, this is one of those questions where I don't think President Trump was not prepared to engage in that, and I don't think he would have been able to bring the right temperament for that process. But one question I think we'll have to see is that is there a way where perhaps a more engaged American diplomacy on this, and perhaps even at some point including President Biden, could that perhaps change things in a way that might break some of the log jams that would allow you to move towards a settlement, at least in Donbass? Crimea is going to be a problem for decades, but in the United States, we know how to do non-recognition policy. We did it for almost 5 decades with the Baltic states. But the thing is, the focus, I think, should be on trying to end the conflict in Donbass, because even though the level of fighting has died down in the last 6 months, it's still claimed between 13 and 14,000 lives.
Thank you for that. We had a question, Clint, and we're getting close to time, so we'll see how many more we can get in. But one about who you think will likely win these 3 internet wars, at least in the short term, and what can the U.S. and its allies do to position themselves more strongly?
So in the short term, because they're not meeting resistance, China will advance the strongest, quickly. They're just organized and they have control and they have resources. For the Western, Russia will not, because no matter what they try and do, they struggle to control the social media pipes and the internet to a degree. They have an agency that does it, but it never works quite right, or they mistakenly turn off the wrong pipe. It's just technologically tough for them to do it. And as Victoria mentioned, there's so many people and so much discussion now, you really can't take that away, once they have it. There's just no incentive to do it. Whereas China has a social scoring system, there's a strong incentive to do what the system says you want. For the US, they could go either way. And it really, really comes down to how they have conversations around Silicon Valley. The regulators here in the United States, and I've testified over and over at the Senate, I've done closed doors with them. They're always screaming and upset about the internet, and we're going to break it up, and we're going to break it. No, they're not. No one wants a terrible Google search engine. They're not going to be able to do that. You really can't unwind many of these things. But there is one thing that does need to be done, which is these tech companies need to decide what internet they're going to be in. So for a long time, Silicon Valley has gone through this perception that they're global companies, or we will link the world, or we're the heroes of the Arab Spring, and those sorts of things. That was all great marketing. But many of the ills of the world have also come about from these platforms over time. The good things come first, and then bad actors come to these platforms and they pursue their ends as well. And so there's still this sort of notion, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, you're seeing them all go through the struggle right now. What is the optimal sort of way to deal with all these regulatory environments, keep your products moving and your audience big? And also, what do you represent? And tech companies will have to decide, are they about democracy and Western values or not? Are they about free and open information or not? Those things will be on the table. And I don't think it'll be the Senate that'll solve it. I think it ultimately will be some of these other competing internets shoving them in ways that they'll have to decide. TikTok is the most fascinating one to me personally right now, just watching it kind of get beat around like a soccer ball between all these different environments.
Great. Well, we're almost at time, so I'll try to do a really quick lightning round so we can get a final word from everyone. What's the one thing that you would want to prioritize when it comes to US-Russia relations? Ambassador Pifer, Steve, I'll kick it off with you.
Yeah, I would say a restoration of fairly intense military contacts, because one thing that you've had over the last 6 or 7 years is more frequent cases where you have American and Russian warplanes and warships operating in close proximity.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to take measures to make sure that you don't have an accident or miscalculation that leads into some kind of a crisis that neither side wants.
Great point. Victoria.
Dialogue in different spheres and in different contexts, in expert sphere, of course, in diplomatic sphere, in expert sphere, academic sphere, people-to-people context.
Mm-hmm. Great.
When youth is talking, we see the possibility for better understanding.
And Clint.
I would say one thing would be kind of from the American side is sustaining the fight against disinformation. They've actually done quite a bit, despite the president kind of being the lead disinformation peddler in the world, you know, to a degree. Like, they have got their hands around it a little bit. And with him sort of out of Twitter, I think that's a way to sort of kind of come to a detente around how we're going to manage information. And that should we, you know, I do think we have a lever point against Putin right now. We said, look, you know, we didn't mess around with your election. We'll do it authentically and overtly in your face. You know, those tech companies are here in the US. So like, we do have a strong hand in that space, I think, that we could come to some sort of position like, let's knock this off.
Thanks. And I realize it wasn't a fair question for you, given your point earlier about about where boundaries are. But at any rate, this obviously could have gone on for much longer. You all are fascinating, and thank you so much for just the work that you do and the time that you put into having this conversation. I think it's a really important one, as we can all see. It's exceedingly complex. It's not just about state-to-state relations. It's about the use of technology. It's about history and narratives. There's so much that is woven into this. So we really appreciate being able to have you join us today. So thank you so much. We will put this up on our YouTube channel. Our next event is next Tuesday at 11 a.m. So it's a little bit earlier than usual, and it's on gender and geopolitics and the role of women in foreign affairs. You can RSVP on our website. We have a QR code here. It should be a fascinating conversation. So upcoming event. We are still trying to keep these briefings free and open to everyone around the world. And as a nonprofit, we rely on contributions. So if you have the opportunity and ability to, please do donate. And lastly, if you did enjoy this discussion and have a lot to say, because I think a lot of us do, please join the post-event discussion group. I think Brian shared a link in the chat. And there's the QR code there. If you use QR codes, it will take a few minutes to get everyone over ending this webinar and over to the next, but please do. We'd love to meet you. We'd love to just have 15 minutes or so just to share what we've learned. So thank you, Steve, Victoria, Clint, really appreciate your time. And thanks to everyone who asked questions. It was a very engaging time. So thank you all and have a great day.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.